Thank you. I want to begin by thanking our hosts at USFQ, especially Luis, Santiago Gandatena, Pedro Romero, and my student hosts, Nicole and Jose, who've shown me around. This is my first quinceañera, so I'm excited about that. But I want to apologize first for speaking in English. No puedo hablar español. And I also want to apologize because almost everything I want to say has already been said by the earlier speakers, but now you can hear it in English or in translation if you have the headphones. Yesterday morning, Pedro took me to the museums in the historic center of Quito, and I came home with some souvenirs in my pocket, some paper souvenirs, some tickets. And one of the tickets I looked at in my hotel room, it was the entrance ticket to the Central Bank's Numismatic Museum. And it's a large ticket. I'm sorry I didn't bring it. It has a photograph on the front of it of a gold coin, an Ecuadorian gold coin from 1834. And there's a very interesting legend that runs around the edge of the coin. It says, El poder en la Constitución. What does that mean? What power are they talking about? They're talking about the power of the people to limit their government. I had another slip of paper in my pocket when I got back, and that was my receipt from paying for lunch with a credit card. And on that piece of paper was the legend, IVA 10%. This is a different kind of power. This is the power to tax, the power of the authorities to tax and control. And this represents the battle that every society is in, Ecuador no less than others. So in this context, we can understand dollarization. Dollarization, quite remarkably, in Ecuador was not a design for monetary policy that policymakers imposed on the economy. It was a system that was chosen by the people. It rose from the bottom up. It was a choice by people in Ecuador to, in a competition, you might say, among monetary standards. And quite understandably, people preferred a sounder money over a less sound money. And by dollarizing themselves, they dislodged the sucre, put it to rest, spontaneously established a de facto US dollar standard. This is well before official dollarization. As Dr. Villalba showed us last night, the dollarization of the economy was already 77% before the official dollarization. And eventually the government stopped fighting the people, stopped fighting their choice of a monetary standard. But the struggle goes on because there continue to be attempts by the state to use legal penalties and subsidies to slow or to reverse the choice that people have made in their money. And this is, to do this is to violate the principle that individuals are sovereign, at least over their own household property. Right? The money in your pocket is your property. Too few of my fellow economists understand the struggle this way. I accept my make an exception for my colleagues back home at George Mason and at USFQ. Most economists, of course, recognize that competitive markets are good for consumers. And better for producers too, than state-granted monopolies. For example, as a consumer, it's better to have a choice among cell phone companies than to have one state-owned cell phone company your only choice. Right? So if we make economic policy with the welfare, the well-being of the individuals in mind, we leave their choices open. We respect their sovereignty to make choices, and we don't restrict who's allowed to serve them. A lot of economists, though, seem to think that money is an exception to this rule, that there can only be one money in an economy, and therefore it's the usual policy conclusion is that the state should run the monetary system in the public interest, but it's a complete non sequitur. Economists who think that way are looking at models on the blackboard or on their computers. They ought to look outside the window. The idea that there will be a convergence on a common monetary standard, that's real, that does exist, but it's not the only characteristic that people care about, that they want to use the money that they used yesterday. It's also important that money be low cost to hold and to use. And when people are free to choose, they will abandon a currency, no matter how well established, that's not serving them well, no matter how locally dominant it is. If its purchasing power is disappearing, people will protect themselves by moving to a money that promises to hold its purchasing power better. I mean, if that weren't true, if an established monetary standard could never be dislodged, Ecuador would still be using the sucre. So when policymakers think about dollarization as something that it's up to them to decide, according to some wise top-down plan for the economy, they're failing to think about dollarization as it actually occurred in Ecuador, which is from the bottom up, as a market phenomenon, growing from the individual preference for a more trustworthy currency over a less trustworthy currency. Instead, they're thinking about monetary policy as a tool to engineer the economy, to manipulate the economy by some kind of expert policy analysis. Of course, they usually have themselves in mind as the policy advisors or the policy makers. So they're not being citizen advocates, they're being advisors to the technical advisors to the state. If you read what's written by those kind of economists, they have three main objections to dollarization. That is for people who are looking at it as a technique for managing the economy rather than as an expression of consumer preference. So the first is the domestic government loses señoraje, the profit they could make from issuing currency. And there is something unique about currency, which is it's about the only line of business in which any government can make a profit. Governments can't make profits even with a monopoly of the post office somehow, but they can make a profit just slapping some ink on a piece of paper until that becomes worthless. They can make a profit doing that, and they would like to do that. To do that means being a monopolist in the market for currency. So that's the first objection. The second objection is that using another country's currency is an insult to the national pride, or sometimes it's even said sovereignty, an insult to the national sovereignty. And the third complaint is the hope that the domestic central bank can improve outcomes in the economy by controlling the quantity of money in some thoughtful way, that they can moderate business cycles, make the economy run more smoothly. Often that's the reason they cite for wanting to take control over the monetary system, even if the motive is actually the first one, the fiscal revenue motive. So let's talk about them in that order. Again, if an economist cites seigniorage as a reason not to dollarize, what they're assuming is that seigniorage means a wealth transfer to the Federal Reserve System of the United States. Every $1 million in Federal Reserve notes held in Ecuador is an interest-free loan to the government of the United States that the domestic government could have had if only its currency had been held instead. But we have to remember that not as much of their currency would have been held because it wasn't as good. People don't hold much when the inflation rate skyrockets. They hold as little currency as they can. But more importantly, to think that it's some kind of tragedy for seigniorage to go abroad, when consumers prefer to import foreign currency, is to make a very mercantilist argument. Right? We shouldn't let consumers buy imports. We should keep things bottled up in the country. We should protect the domestic industry of issuing money from foreign competition. Most economists would say, well, that's against the well-being of the economy when it comes to other goods, but somehow they have a blind spot when it comes to money. I'm going to try to explain later how the seigniorage that is lost by the domestic government doesn't need to be lost by the economy. It doesn't actually need to go abroad. You can have dollar-denominated currency issued here in Ecuador that's not a liability of the government, that's a liability of the banks, right? That's privately issued. I'll talk about some precedents for that. But one response to the, I'll talk about how that eliminates the objection that the seigniorage is going to go abroad. It also has some other nice features that I'll talk about. When it comes to the national pride objection, I like the response that the former head of the Central Bank of Argentina had. While he was president of the central bank, he was advocating dollarization for Argentina on the grounds that he couldn't resist the pressure to print money to pay the government's bills, but if they could dollarize, that would be a system that would be fiscally more tamper-proof. His name was Pedro Powell. He says, look, we don't suggest that every country should produce every possible good. We're happy with the idea that we should import automobiles or TV sets when other countries produce them more efficiently. Why don't we apply the same logic to money? So this is the logic of consumer sovereignty. I'm going to argue that that logic applies most clearly to the monetary standard, not necessarily to the physical paper bills. Those can be produced locally on a dollar standard. Okay. That will depend, of course, on whether people trust domestic banks as the issuers of the liabilities. So we'll talk about that issue later. Let me come third to the objection that it takes away the power to run monetary policy in a way that would stabilize the economy or mitigate business cycles. This is really a kind of wishful thinking if you actually look at the historical record. It's a kind of wishful thinking we call Keynesian economics. And there's an associated theory with it, not to get too technical, called the theory of optimum currency areas. And the theory of optimum currency areas is very much based on a top-down view in what area can we run a monetary policy that will improve over having independent currencies and the option of devaluing. In the written version of my remarks, I pick on, in particular, a paper by the well-known economist Jeffrey Sachs and a co-author, Felipe Lorraine, that appeared just before Ecuador dollarized. It appeared in August 1999 because it was under discussion at that point. Right? And so they were addressing, not always explicitly, but addressing the debate over dollarization in Ecuador. And the title of their article tells you where they stand. Their title is, "Dollarization is more straitjacket than salvation." Right? But it's a completely false choice, false dichotomy, because dollarization is a salvation when you need a straitjacket on domestic monetary policy, when domestic monetary policy is so irresponsible that a straitjacket is better. I think it's plausible to argue. I mean, I think it's almost surely true that dollarization has saved the Ecuadorian economy from the political crises it's gone through. Right? 5 presidents between 2000 and 2006, and yet the currency was not disturbed. There weren't problems of inflation, there wasn't devaluation. It was a kind of shield from the economy, and here I'm paraphrasing Mauricio Pozo. He describes it as a brake on governments. But rather than call it a straitjacket or a brake, which sounds kind of, unpleasant and not very nice to the government, I have a more pleasant analogy. Let's call it retirement. We let the poor policymakers retire from the very difficult job of trying to manage the economy and release them from that hard work. if you reread the article by Sachs and Lorraine, you see very dire warnings about dollarization. We don't hear those arguments so much anymore because they've proven false. But it's good to revisit them because you still hear the echoes of them. Sachs and Lorraine warned that if a country, for example, Ecuador, chooses to adopt the US dollar, that choice is, quote, unwarranted, even reckless. Dollarization is an extreme solution to market instability, applicable in only the most extreme cases. Right? Well, calling what happened in Ecuador in 1999 market instability is not really identifying the source of the instability, because the instability didn't come from the market. It came from irresponsible policymaking. And the dollarization of Ecuador eliminated the problem of irresponsible domestic monetary policy. And there's nothing reckless about that. It's no more reckless for Ecuador to be dollarized than it is for Puerto Rico to be dollarized. And I actually looked up the numbers, and the economies are pretty much the same size, and both have the United States as the largest trading partner, which makes the dollar the obvious choice. Here's what Sachs and Lorraine thought was their case against dollarization. They say, for legitimate reasons of its own, perhaps to lend pesos to the government to cover a budgetary shortfall, or perhaps to spur the domestic economy, country X, they're being very general here, country X may need a monetary expansion even if the United States does not. So they think the problem with dollarization is that you're not going to get the monetary expansion you need because you're tying your monetary policy to the US monetary policy. And here's their warning. That decision makes sense only if US monetary policy is wholly appropriate for its national economy, which is rarely the case. So I wanted to dissect that in a little bit of detail. First, note this curious claim that it's a legitimate reason to print money in whatever amount, apparently, to enable the government to cover a budgetary shortfall, which means to spend more than they have coming in, to finance spending that's beyond their means. I find this very curious. What does it mean to call legitimate a monetary policy that's been responsible for every case of hyperinflation in the post-war world? Secondly, they claim that printing money is appropriate to spur the domestic economy, like the economy is a horse that needs to be spurred occasionally. Well, the economy is not a horse. There are technical conditions in which the quantity of money is too small for the given level of prices. Right? You can describe that, if you like, as a shortage of money. People aren't holding as much money as they would like to. And in that case, it's appropriate to have an increase in the quantity of money. But that was not the problem in Ecuador in 1999, so it's kind of an irrelevant side issue. Right? Ecuador was not suffering from a shortage of paper sucres. Under dollarization, that problem actually remedies itself. Sachs and Lorraine never noticed this. But under dollarization, the demand for dollars goes up, dollars flow into the economy. If the demand for dollars goes down, they flow out of the economy until demand is satisfied and there's no excess and no shortage of dollars. So it's a self-adjusting mechanism. And finally, there's a kind of fallacy in their argument. They're judging dollarization by a standard of perfection. A professor of mine, my graduate training was at UCLA, which we like to think of in Los Angeles as the capital of Latin America. He referred to this kind of standard of perfection as a nirvana fallacy. They're judging the real world by comparison to some unattainable ideal. And saying only if U.S. monetary policy is wholly appropriate, which basically means perfect for Ecuador, does it make sense for the country to dollarize? But that's, of course, not the relevant benchmark. The relevant benchmark, especially when domestic monetary policy is wildly imperfect and has no chance of becoming perfect, the relevant benchmark is, was the US dollar more trustworthy than the sucre? And that's a decision that each citizen makes for himself or herself. Right? The choice of which currency to put in your wallet. You vote with your purses. that choice doesn't need to be made top-down, doesn't need expert policy advisors to tell the government what to impose on everybody. And it was a choice made from the bottom up, as I've said before. There's a further related objection to dollarization, which is that it means the absence of an official lender of last resort in the dollarized economy. A lender of last resort means that the central bank provides support to commercial banks when they're short on liquidity. So if a lender of last resort follows the classical prescription for a lender of last resort that we owe to Walter Bagehot, they only lend to commercial banks. They only lend to commercial banks that are short of reserves, perhaps due to a bank run, and only to banks that are solvent, because banks that are not solvent ought to be closed. They're turning valuable assets into worthless liabilities. They're wasting capital. But a bank that's solvent and yet being run upon anyway is worth saving. And a classical lender of last resort is supposed to verify that the bank is solvent and only lend at a high rate of interest so that the borrower regrets having put themselves in a position of illiquidity, in a position where they have skimped on holding enough liquid assets or reserves. Central banks have not in practice made good use of this responsibility. They have far too often lent to banks that were insolvent or without checking whether they were solvent, and lent to them at concessionary interest rates, not at penalty interest rates. That encourages loose banking, moral hazard is the technical term, right? Greater risk-taking. If I run out of reserves because I'm not managing my portfolio properly, the central bank will rescue me. Now there's an alternative for a dollarized economy, as even Sachs and Lorraine recognized in their article, and that is establish lines of credit in dollar money center cities, in New York, right? Establish a line of credit from a U.S. commercial bank, which is what the banks in Panama do. That doesn't create moral hazard because commercial banks are not going to give money away. They're only going to lend to banks, illiquid banks, that will pay them back. And they're going to lend at an interest rate that covers the risk at a penalty rate. So they're constrained by market forces. So that's actually a better system of having a liquidity lifeline than having a domestic authority whose interests lie in making life easy for domestic banks, not in encouraging them to behave prudently. So if we look at Ecuador's experience with dollarization, it seems to be impossible to judge it anything but a success. Some critics, like outside the country, like Sachs and Lorraine, were predicting doom and gloom. Some critics within the country were predicting that the transition would mean some kind of chaos or deep recession with high unemployment for many years. And of course, the opposite happened. Growth resumed once the disturbances caused by the collapsing sucre were removed. And of course, the economy was already highly dollarized, as I've mentioned. The usual term for this is unofficial dollarization. I prefer to call it Dolarización popular. It's from the people. Making it official in January 2000, kind of belatedly, helped to complete the transition from the disorder of a collapsing currency to the calm of a relatively stable currency. And notice I'm judging the dollar by saying it's relatively stable. It's not perfect, but the question is not can you get perfection? You can't. The question is can you get something better? So the economy responded almost immediately with growth. So growth in 2000 was slow, but at least it was slightly positive. 2001, 2002, the economy resumed very healthy growth rates and has ever since. One way to judge Ecuador's macroeconomic performance, instead of comparing it to pre-2000, is to look across the globe, look at other countries. An American economist named Steve Hanke, who I think has been mentioned before, has cooked up a ranking macroeconomic indicators in countries. He calls it a misery index. And his misery index is constructed, it's pretty simple. You add up the country's current inflation rate, the interest rate in the economy, I'm not sure exactly which interest rate, but let's see, the relatively risk-free interest rate, the unemployment rate, those are all bad things, and then you subtract the growth of the economy in real terms over the past year, so that's a good thing. So subtract the good thing from the three bad things, and you get a measure of misery. How much misery is there in the economy? Well, if you look around South America, who do you think has the most misery? Venezuela. It's not only number one in South America, it's number one in the world right now. Que lastima. Ecuador's score is the best in South America. Is that due to dollarization? Well, let's look at the other dollarized economy in Latin America. The only two countries with better scores in Latin America are El Salvador and Panama. The only two other dollarized countries. Right? And the reason Ecuador is in third place and not in first or second place in that group is interest rates are high here. And they're high because of sovereign risk, right? Which is not something that dollarization cures, unfortunately. Dollarization's also improved the banking system. There was a study by two analysts at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta who noted that dollarization, by eliminating the official lender of last resort, right, no agency now is able to create create bank reserves with the push of a button, eliminates that source of moral hazard. So it has reduced risky bank behavior. It's actually made bank runs less likely because banks have to behave in such a way as to preserve confidence in them. And banks in Ecuador have managed their own solvency and their liquidity risks much better since dollarization than they were doing before. There was some change in the ranks of the bankers. Some failed in the chaos of 1999, but basically it's a change in the incentives banks face about how prudently to behave. Now it pays to be more prudent. And in the institutional framework, they no longer have such risks of devaluation and depreciation of the currency. They no longer have a mismatch between dollar assets and sucre liabilities or vice versa. So it's a safer environment for banks. And this shouldn't have been a surprise to anyone, because if you look at other dollarized banking systems like Panama, they're the best you can find in Latin America. Or if you look around the world and look at offshore banking centers, right? The Cayman Islands, the Bahamas, Jersey and Guernsey. They don't have any official lenders of last resorts, the banks that are operating offshore. And they don't have any crises either, because they're not guaranteed by anybody, they can't attract funds unless they behave in an observably prudent way. And that sort of effect is what's been realized in Ecuador as well. So Ecuadorian banks are now holding higher reserves, they're holding a higher share of liquid assets, and they're holding safer asset portfolios than they did before dollarization. The effect has been encouraging to the public when it comes to whether they want to put their money in banks. If you look at the ratio of bank deposits to GDP, it's gone up from below 20% to now above 30%. So that's good. That means more intermediation, more funds available to entrepreneurs to finance the kind of projects that actually do provide economic growth over the long term. So to summarize the experience, lower inflation, financial deepening, that is more deposits as a percent of GDP, therefore encouraging real investment and real growth. And of course lower transaction costs for importing and exporting from the United States or from other dollarized economies. What it hasn't done, which is kind of a disappointment, is to provide more fiscal discipline. Right? There was a hope that if the government was more constrained, that they didn't have the option to print money to pay bills that weren't otherwise paid, that they would be more prudent about restraining spending. But of course, revenues have also risen and spending have risen and spending in excess of revenues has risen. So it hasn't really provided that kind of discipline yet. I'm afraid that you're on your own. Dollarization is not going to provide that for you. But if you look at the improvement in the banking system, I think there's great room for optimism. And I'm hoping, and it's only been 15 years, I'm hoping that it's a step toward the experience of Panama, which has more than 100 years of experience and the deepest financial markets, the most efficient banks in Latin America, as we've already heard tonight. Now, here's my proposal to extend the gains from dollarization, and this is something I don't think I've heard anybody else say. Allow competition among issuers of dollar banknotes. You don't have to use Federal Reserve notes. You could have claims to Federal Reserve notes if you trusted the issuers of them. And the benefit of that is that they can provide more services, and maybe the most concrete of those is it's no longer costly for banks then to stock their automatic teller machines, right? Their cajeros automáticos. They put their own liabilities, their own banknotes in the machines. Now, where do I get this crazy idea? You can actually observe this in the places in the world that still allow private commercial banks to issue paper currency, namely in Scotland, in Northern Ireland, and in Hong Kong. I'm careful to say places because saying that Scotland is a country is kind of controversial. And I once gave a talk to some officials from a city in China, and when I said that Hong Kong was a country, they quickly corrected me. It's a special autonomous region. But Ecuador could take this kind of step that it wasn't a change in Scotland and Northern Ireland, it was a continuation of hundreds of years of experience. And originally the banknotes were redeemable for gold and silver coins. Now they're redeemable for Bank of England coins. But they didn't ever lose the right to issue notes. And so it's not a fanciful idea. If you look back in the history to the gold standard era, private commercial banks are the main issuers of currency. Adam Smith in the famous Wealth of Nations talks about how this has been a benefit to Scotland, that instead of tying up a lot of the national wealth in gold and silver coins, we now use paper substitutes. They're just as reliable as gold and silver coins, but we're able to use the gold and silver to buy equipment, to invest in the economy. Ecuador could do the same kind of thing. That is, hold dollar-denominated banknotes, which are liabilities of the bank, and enable them to finance loans instead of holding Federal Reserve notes outright. Now, completely optional, of course. And when I say optional or voluntary, I mean it. Right? There would be lots of banks with this privilege, or with this being allowed to issue the notes, and if you didn't trust any of them, you wouldn't have to hold any of their notes. You could hold Federal Reserve notes. But it would tie up less wealth in Federal Reserve notes and deepen the financial system. There's an important paper by George Selgin, who's mentioned earlier, and a co-author named William Lestraps, where they actually try to estimate how much capital formation could be brought about in this way. Right? Because when people hold either external fiat currency or their own government's fiat currency, what they're financing is government debt. They're not financing capital formation. If we substituted banknotes issued by commercial banks, then holding currency would be a means of financing capital formation, not government debt. So we have these living examples. In Scotland, there are still 3 private banks that issue notes. They're denominated in pounds sterling, which is the British monetary unit. In Northern Ireland, there are 4 commercial banks, and I find this charming. One of the local banks was acquired by a bank from Denmark, so you can now, in Northern Ireland, in Belfast, get banknotes that say Danske Bank on them. But one interesting thing these banks do, and this comes back to the question of the affront to national pride in using banknotes with Benjamin Franklin's picture on them. They're a little more imaginative than central banks are when it comes to choosing who to put on the currency, because central banks always put dead politicians on the banknotes. The Bank of Scotland has the poet Walter Scott. And this is very much a footnote, but Walter Scott in 1826 wrote a pamphlet defending the Scottish banking system against assault from the Parliament in London, which was threatening some features of it. The Clydesdale Bank has pictures of Lord Kelvin, the scientist, on one of its notes, Adam Smith, the economist, a missionary on one of its notes, the poet Robert Burns on another one of its notes. The Danske Bank has John Boyd Dunlop, who invented the inflatable tire. I didn't know that until I looked this up. I saw who was on their banknote. Who was he? And Harry Ferguson, who developed the modern farm tractor. A few years ago, they issued a note with a football player on it. George Best was his name. It probably doesn't mean anything to you. Doesn't to me, but that's one way to make currency more attractive to people. I like to joke that if we allowed this in the United States, we would have banks issuing notes with Elvis Presley on them. Absolutely. Okay, so it's not maybe as obvious what the benefits are to the note holder, but the practical benefit you get in Scotland or Northern Ireland is you don't have to pay fees to withdraw money. The bank stocks its own banknotes into the machine, and they're happy to have you take them out because now that's a larger set of banknotes they have in circulation that helps finance more interest earning for them. And they also compete by, as I said, making the notes more attractive, making them more counterfeit proof. Right? They're way ahead on the technology when it's their money at stake. So it's really very much like allowing banks to compete in issuing checking accounts. Right? It's a different kind of liability. It's a claim on the bank, but one that travels from hand to hand without having to go through the clearing system. So we all know that currency is more useful for some kind of transactions. So any economist who cares about the individual's welfare ought to recognize that this kind of competition is also more beneficial to consumers than monopoly in the issue of banknotes. Now, this same principle of respecting individual sovereignty and what kind of money you want to use, so it applies to the monetary standard, it applies to who issues the claims denominated in that monetary standard. It applies to new kinds of quasi-monetary assets like Bitcoin. I don't see any reason people shouldn't be free to use Bitcoin if they want to use Bitcoin. And yet, of course, the law that authorized the new electronic currency for the government of Ecuador to issue outlawed Bitcoin and every other kind of competition with their electronic currency. Now, I've been talking very generally about the benefits to consumers of competition in the monetary arena, but it's most important to the competition among currency issuers is most important to people who rely most heavily on cash. And that means the poor and the unbanked. Right? Sophisticated people with lots of money can get a competitive rate of interest on it. But people who are holding almost nothing but currency as their means of transacting payment are quite exposed when the currency becomes unstable. So they have the most to gain. And this principle of individual sovereignty sort of works hand in hand with the principle of the rule of law to protect people's wealth from confiscation. And of course, we've seen examples of outright confiscation in Argentina, as we've just heard about, but also in Peru and Bolivia in the 1980s. It's important to take a stand against that. So let me talk now about the US dollar and the popularity of the US dollar. So I'm sure you know this, but my country has something in common with Ecuador. We also use the US dollar. But of course, we're not alone. Panama also uses the US dollar since 1904, El Salvador since 2001, and many other countries use the people use the US dollar, even if the government has not officially adopted the US dollar. And not just in Latin America, also in the Caribbean, in the Bahamas, even Canada has about 10% of its deposits in US dollars rather than Canadian dollars. But in Costa Rica, it's 50%, in Nicaragua, 80%, in Uruguay, Peru, Paraguay, Bolivia, you get dollarization ratios between 45% and 75%, so it's a very popular choice. It seems to me that if more than half of the bank deposits, or more than half of the currency, is in US dollars, for example, the US dollar ought to be treated as the legal equivalent of the local currency. There shouldn't be discrimination against it. Public sector employees should be free to ask to be paid in dollars, and taxpayers should be free to pay their taxes in dollars. Well, free in the choice of what they pay, which currency they use, not how much they pay. And in that way, you avoid sort of forcing people to use the money they don't want to use, or letting the government force people. And if the percent of dollarization gets above, I don't know what you want to make the benchmark, 2/3 or 75%, then it's time to toss in the towel. It's time to retire the local currency if nobody wants it. If the only reason anybody holds it is because they're paid in it and it takes a day to get rid of it. If you look at it from the point of view of the United States, it's quite remarkable. More than half of the Federal Reserve notes on the books of the Federal Reserve System are estimated to be outside the United States. So we don't know exactly where they are, but estimates are, based on various methods of estimation, about 55% is outside the United States. So that's $715 billion based on the current stock of currency. One of the tip-offs that a lot of it's outside the country is that more than half of the Federal Reserve notes in circulation are $100 bills. Those of us who carry, Federal Reserve notes in our wallet don't usually carry half of the value in $100 bills. So, but in countries where it's used especially as a savings vehicle, or for a large transaction vehicle, that's what you'd expect. So I've said that the move to dollarization, official dollarization in Ecuador in January 2000, most fundamentally meant that the government had finally bowed to the verdict of the people, who had already pretty thoroughly dollarized their own transactions and their own finances. But of course that concession to freedom of choice in currency didn't just happen. It had to be argued for. And I'm reliably informed that it took years of ideological groundwork laid by some of the speakers we've had earlier and yesterday. Joyce de Janata, I had to be instructed that her name was Joyce and not Joyce. That's my own problem. Dora de Ampuero, and with some foreign assistance, I'm proud to say, by my own former student, Kurt Schuler, who came to Ecuador during the dollarization debate. And a student of mine wrote a term paper for a course I taught 2 years ago on monetary theory, a paper about the dollarization process in Ecuador. I learned a lot from this paper, and I learned from this paper that the presidents of the universities in Quito and Guayaquil also helped promote the idea of dollarization in 1998 and 1999. My source for this history of the local debate, the author of this term paper, was Santiago J. Gangotena. And when I discovered that the host of this conference had the same name, I emailed my student and said, is this a coincidence? Is everybody in Quito named Santiago Gangotena? Or are you related to the president of USFQ? He said, yes, that's my father. It was a wise move on the part of those arguing for dollarization not to settle for a currency board or something halfway like a currency board that would leave the government, like they did in Argentina, with the power to still monetize the government's debt. And of course, Argentina, the situation broke down when the government used the Caja de Conversión to buy the government's own debt at inflated prices. That eventually sparked a speculative attack, and they didn't defend the peso, they devalued. With dollarization, you don't have that threat. Okay? There's no speculative attack possible. So, let me see how I'm doing on time.
We are
Okay, so I want to wrap up by talking about the prospects for Ecuador. And so, while we celebrate the 15 years of success with dollarization, I think we have to take note of two dark clouds on the horizon. And the first dark cloud is that you still have a central bank. As our friend from Panama reminded us, you don't need to have a central bank if you're not issuing your own currency. And the Banco Central of Ecuador is assigned the, quote, the responsibility of implementing the monetary, credit, foreign exchange, and financial policies formulated by the executive. ¿Por qué? Right? Why? And we shouldn't have any doubt that the executive would like to have a monetary policy to conduct. And we should expect that I learned a new word yesterday, funcionarios. The funcionarios of the BCE would like to enlarge the scope of the good they can do by having more discretionary powers. But we know that granting more discretionary powers is pointing back to the conditions of 1999. It's not the route forward. With dollarization, you don't need a central bank. The second cloud that's already come up in this conference is the plans of the government to issue its own digital mobile phone currency. Starting next month is the plan. Now, I'm not against the idea of claims to dollars, but I'm against the idea of a monopoly in claims to dollars, whether in paper form or in electronic stored on a cell phone form. This kind of cell phone currency has been introduced in other places in the world by private firms. And so it's actually had to pass a market test. And these firms compete with each other to provide the service on competitive terms, on efficient terms. So the M-Pesa system, which has been mentioned by the government as a model, was introduced by Vodafone. There's a system in Paraguay, Giros Tigo. It's run by Tigo. So if there's a market demand for that kind of service in Ecuador, and it seems like there would be, there's a large unbanked population that have cell phones, why not let private mobile phone companies provide it? Right? Then you get an efficiency test, you get competitive choice by people who are using the system. If you don't like Movistar's service, you can go to Claro. It's very much like competition among checking account providers, among banks, right? Allowing you convenient ways to transfer your money. There's nothing in the provision of transferable dollar credits or claims that the market will fail to provide it efficiently. If you look at all the systems around the world, you see they provide it very efficiently. You know, it's a very popular way to transfer money where people are unbanked. Senor Villalba told us last night that the new system will be voluntary, but when the government gives itself a monopoly on a service, that's not really voluntary. It's take it or leave it. Nobody else is allowed to compete and offer the service on different terms with different features and possibly more reliably, because if I had to choose between trusting my money to a company that's under the rule of law that has to pay me back or I can sue them, and that has competition that makes them behave in a responsible way, and putting my money with an organization that has none of those constraints, I'd be reluctant to choose the second. So it's very curious that a government that claims to be seeking to provide the poor with lower cost access to payment systems would create a monopoly, banning the more efficient providers, who could do it at lower cost, and would ban Bitcoin. Bitcoin's great potential is providing low-cost remittances. I looked up the volume of remittances to Ecuador just from the United States, and it's about 3% of Ecuador's GDP. The average Ecuadorian working in the United States sent home $2,607 in 2012. So if you can reduce the fees on transferring that amount of money, that makes a big difference to the recipients. Okay, so there isn't any good economic reason to run this kind of payment system as a government monopoly. So what's the real reason? It seems likely that it's meant as a fiscal measure, right? It's that interest-free loan that the government is looking for. Now, the government has said that it won't use the new currency to fund public spending. I think we heard that last night. But this is hard to fathom. Either the system loses money or it makes money. If it makes a profit, where's it going to go other than to finance government spending? But if the government can make a profit, then I'm sure that the mobile phone companies can do it more efficiently. Okay, so it's hard to make any sense of this project other than as a first step toward de-dollarization. And we've all read the quotes from the president about his dislike for dollarization because it limits the discretion of the government. But that is exactly the great virtue of dollarization. Okay. The new legislation also creates a junta, right, de política y regulación monetaria y financiera, pardon the pronunciation, and gives it the power to declare and define the monetary, credit, foreign exchange, and financial policies. What's that about? Well, what's the point of creating a junta for monetary policy in a dollarized economy? It seems to me it can only be looking forward to a de-dollarized economy. So that's what you have to be worried about. And here's a practical example of why you have to be worried. And the case is the country of Liberia. Okay, not the most parallel case, but Liberia used to use just the US dollar. Liberia was founded by former slaves from the United States, so there's always been a strong connection. Right, so it's in the west coast of Africa. They introduced Liberian dollars just as small change at first. Then the government decided it could make a profit introducing paper Liberian dollars. And of course, initially it was 1-to-1 with the US dollar, and the promise was it would always be 1-to-1 with the US dollar. I looked up the exchange rate. It's now 92 Liberian dollars per US dollar, and the value of the Liberian dollar fell 12.5% last year. So that's the wedge you have to be concerned about. Now, fortunately, the popular part of dollarization is harder to undo. People in Liberia still keep about, the estimate is 90% of their currency and deposits in US dollars. So the Liberian government doesn't actually accomplish much by issuing its own money other than a little bit of tax revenue and a great nuisance to everybody who has to balance between the two currencies. So I'm sure you don't need an outsider's advice on this issue, and I'm sure efforts, as we've heard about, are already underway. But I would advise anybody who's a friend of dollarization to resist this project as far as possible, to have government issue mobile phone credits before it starts. And if I can conclude with a little bit of Spanish, I believe the appropriate expression is corten de raíz. Thank you very much.